Beautiful. Well, as I was saying to you, I've recently finished running with the Kenyans, and as a lover of distance running for as long as I can remember, and in particular a lover of East Africans, but particularly Paul Turgat from Kenya,
Oh yeah,
Noah
yeah.
Nien from Kenya, Bernard Lagat, former Kenyan. I've got a real soft spot in my heart for the Kenyans, which is, I think, how your book came onto the radar. Someone recommended it to me, and as soon as I heard about it, I thought, okay, I'm going to have to delve into this. And I commute quite a lot from where I live into Melbourne, about an hour and a half drive. And I reckon after about 2.5 drives there and back, the book was done. And I was so sad because it was just, I felt like I was on the journey there with you. It's really interesting to hear about the trip, which we'll get into, and so many of the principles and characteristics that you speak about in such great detail. But I thought what might be a really good way to kickstart the conversation of how you actually even ended up in Kenya, which you actually kickstart the book with, was a little bit about your own story through high school and college and your running journey and your fascination with what actually might lead to, perhaps a breakthrough in your latter half of your athletics career, for lack of a better description.
Yeah, latter half, post, yeah, I might have had an athletics career if I'd started before I was 35. But yeah, I was quite a serious junior athlete, although I did get quite a few injuries, but I was quite obsessed with running. And there was one year the world, so and I was a big fan of the Kenyan runners. I mean, people you mentioned, Paul Turgat, and winning all those world cross country championships, and who else done like I mean, I had a particular favorite race, which was the World Championships. I think it was 1993, the 5,000 meters. Ismail Karuri, he just like blasted away at the front, and they were calling it like suicidal. And Khalid Skar was the favorite, and there was some three Ethiopians, and he just something about the way the Kenyans ran. They would just attack the race, or they would just suddenly go for it. They didn't seem to have any kind of fear, and so I was always kind of fascinated by them. But when I thought about it, I didn't really know anything about them. And there was one year the World Cross Country Championships were in the UK, and I went to watch it. And it was actually Ismail Karuri, so he was kind of my favorite runner. I can't remember whether he won or came second, but he was right at the front. And there was one moment where I was just at this corner I was standing. He made his break, and he came around the corner like it's like full sprint. I was like in the middle of a cross country. I was just like, what? This is crazy. Uh, so I had this kind of fascination with the Kenyans and the way they ran, but that World Cross Country Champs was quite interesting as well because the junior race was won by a Finnish athlete called Anna Marie Sandell, the junior women's race, and I was quite amazed because she was her and then like a whole bunch of Kenyans and Ethiopians. I was like, that's amazing. She beat them, and then I read that she'd been out training in Kenya, and just something in my head was like, wow, that must be like the magic formula. You go out to Kenya and you become this, that's how you do it. It's something going on out there. There must be something, but I didn't know what it was. But then I kind of stopped running for about 10 years, or at least stopped being competitive anyway. I still ran for myself. I just had a few too many injuries, and but that story had always sat in my mind that maybe there was something in the water or something. If you went out there, you just somehow pick it up. And not, I wasn't expecting to be world cross country champion, but you might have some huge improvement. And so then in my 30s, early 30s, I started running again. And by then I was a journalist, and I had this idea I would like to write a book. And I was kind of at the same time looking for a subject, and I was writing quite a lot about running. I was writing for Runner's World magazine, and I just kind of came on this idea of like, what if you went to Kenya and you trained there? And part of me was like to tell the story of the Kenyans, because in some ways it's like, and when I thought about it, I thought this is like the craziest story in sport. You've got the world's most universal, most accessible sport. I mean, every big city in the world has a half marathon or a marathon with thousands of people running, and almost every one of them is won by Kenyans or Ethiopians. And from this tiny corner of East Africa, it's almost like the Gauls, Asterix, and Obelix, these kind of superpowers. So I was like, there must be some kind of story. And I realized I had no idea what their lives were like, who they were, what they thought about, what they did. It was just such an unknown quality and quantity to it. And I remember looking up online to see, I thought I'd love to read a book about that. And there wasn't one. So I thought, wow, no one's written a book. No one's been out there and told this story. So part of me was that the journalist was like, this is a story, this is incredible, someone's got to go out there and tell this story. And then part of me was also thinking about Anna Marie Sandel and thinking, yeah, maybe I'll come back and I'll be a super athlete. So by the time I got out there, yeah, I guess I was like 35, I think. So my goals were a bit more. I kind of tapered down a bit from world cross country champion to probably. I think I had the goal of running a sub 3 hour marathon by that point. So yeah, so when I set out there, I had never run a marathon at that point. So yeah, so then off we set with family in tow. I had 3 small children, and yeah, that's another element of the story.
Yeah, it was a fun element to listen to, actually. I think your daughters may have been slightly older than what my two boys are at the moment, but I sort of kept going back to my wife, Jessie, and just giving her little updates on what was going on in the story. And I'm not sure if I was subconsciously or subliminally trying to suggest the idea that perhaps it's a good idea for our family to make the same trek as what you guys did. But I mean, she was definitely open to the idea. I think it's just the flight that scares us more than anything. We had a couple of trips with our boys last year, and we flew from Australia to America, and that was enough to scare us from international travel until they're a little bit older. But I got to say, I was laying down on the couch at my place listening to the part of the story where you spoke about Ismail Karui from the 1993 World Champs, and I paused the book. I turned on YouTube and I watched the race. I'd never seen it before. And it
Yeah.
was, yeah, right. It was one of the most mind-blowing races. The only race I think that can match it from a world championships perspective, at least over 5,000 meters, in my opinion, was the 2003 World Championships in Paris. With you had Eliud Kipchoge as a 17-year-old,
Oh
you had
yeah.
Hisham El Garouj, and you had Kenenisa Bekele in his prime as well. And at
Yeah.
17, sort of Eliud Kipchoge, that last 80 meters ran around. But obviously, it was
Yeah.
a very different race to what you were or what we witnessed with Karui. That was one of the most amazing things. And it was slightly before the time that I got really interested in athletics. So somehow it had slipped past my radar. But one of the most
Yeah.
amazing parts of that race as well was just being reminded that there was a time when Gebre Selassie didn't win absolutely everything as
I think
well.
I think that was the last race he didn't win for about the next 10 years, actually. But yeah, yeah.
It was incredible. And so from the time you started to flirt with the idea of actually getting back into some serious running to when you're in Iten, or at least in Kenya, what was that turnaround in terms of time frame?
Uh yeah, I mean it was kind of gradual in a way, and I started writing when I started writing for Runner's World magazine. Initially it was writing race reports, and at that point I was pretty unfit. I probably ran once or twice a week. But then when I had very small children at that point, but because I was running these races and I had to write reports about them, I suddenly had an excuse for a kind of justification to my wife why I had to do a bit more training, because I'm like, well, I'm going to run these races. I've got to write about them. I don't want it to be a total struggle, so I should do some training. So it was a little bit sneaky on my part, but it was a way of getting back into the running. And then, yeah, when I decided to go to Kenya, then I really realized, well, I've got to be as fit as I can be. And I started in quite well, actually. I won a big 10K, local 10K, and I slightly underestimated just how good the Kenyans were. I mean, I had been a little bit like you. I had a kind of gap in my life where I wasn't really plugged into running, and I think I slightly lost touch with times. And also as a junior, I was more 5K was probably the furthest I would run, so I had no real idea what a good 10K time was. So I won this race, but I only ran 38 minutes, which I had no idea was actually not that fast. But it must have been a weak field that day. Just because I won, I thought, well, that must be pretty good. And so then I got to Kenya thinking I was quite quick, and not obviously not quick enough to compete, but quick enough to keep up. But obviously, the reality out there is it's a whole nother world. I mean, you could be. So I got out there and there was a race in Iten, and there was a white guy, European guy, and actually I could tell he was British because he had a Winchester AC running vest on, which is a place in England. So I was like, oh, there's this British guy running, and he came last in this cross country race, just in the local town. So I thought, well, that's brave of him, right? And he's giving it a go. So if he can give it a go, I can give it a go. Little did I know, he was the number 2 ranked marathon runner in the UK at the time. So I was kind of comparing myself at that point to him. just because we were both British, and he was last in his race. So yeah, where did that leave me? Well, I found out about 2 weeks later when I entered a race, and yeah, I've never been more humbled in my life. Let's put it that way.
I don't know why it was such a shock to me. I remember you telling that story, and I remember the quality of athlete that you were referring to with the Winchester Athletics shirt on. But I think to hear you describe in depth about the actual depth there is within the Kenyan running scene, and more than that, not only how deep and wide the actual fields go, but how quickly forgotten elite athletes are in just a couple of years, unless they're Olympic gold medalists or silver medalists. Like, unless you're a champion of champions, so many of these athletes just seem to, I'm not sure, just disappear into the wilderness in terms of how many people remember them. So you got to Kenya, you had 38 minutes up your sleeve at this time. Obviously, a pretty clear goal of improving. In terms of what the actual process of you getting into the group, I know you go into this a little bit more detail in the actual book, but with an ego check and the humbling experience of actually getting a real tune up in that first race, like, what was your mindset at the time? Like, because I feel as though in some respects I'm in a similar part of my life to where you were when you actually wrote the book. I'm 36 years old. I've recently committed the next 3 years to trying to run a fast marathon, whatever that is, in a couple of years' time. And at the moment, I'm just in a very early base phase of that. But the idea of where I am in that actual process now, if I went to Kenya, I can imagine the humility that would come with competing against even the 1,000th fastest runner in whatever town would, leave motivation relatively low. Where was your headspace at that point? Were you immediately shaken back to reality, or did you have a sneaking suspicion that over the course of, months or 12 months, you might be able to actually get to an elite level, or where were you sort of shooting for?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I was too old to be an elite runner myself, but yeah, I think there was a lot of naivety on my part. I think if I'd like done the research that you're doing, if I'd read books, talked to people, I'd probably been a lot more nervous about it. I just kind of went there without thinking too much about it, and luckily for me, the Kenyans run their slow run. So this is something we'll talk about, but when they run slowly, they run really slowly. So much so that the first time I ran on an easy run with the Kenyans, I thought they were kind of joking with me. I thought it was at my expense that they were running this slowly. I was like, I don't need to run this slowly, and they were like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Come on, this is not, this is joke." It was like I work in miles, but it was like 10-minute mile pace, which is, I don't know, 6-minute kilometer pace, 6.5-minute
Wow.
kilometer pace. So really, really slow. And I just thought, this can't be real. And then the other thing, they were amazingly kind. So there were a couple of times I ended up on these, what they call progression runs. So I would start out and I was in the group. It was probably that slow, but it would just gradually get quicker. And I didn't really know, what was going on. Someone just said, if you go to this crossroads at 6 a.m., there's a big group, you can run with them. And so I'd be running along quite happily, like totally awe-inspired by the fact that I'm running through the Kenyan countryside in this group of like 200 Kenyans, and I'm keeping up, and this is amazing. But then gradually the pace would start getting quicker and quicker, and I'd start drifting to the back. And then suddenly I realized I don't know where I am. I've got to keep up, but I couldn't keep up. But somebody would always drop back and look after me. It was amazing. And I kind of eventually I worked out not to go on the runs that were going to get too fast, or at least unless I knew where I was, I would pull off. But on those first few runs, when I kind of, like I say, very naively just joined in, somebody always spotted me, and they dropped back, and they stuck with me, and they helped me finish. So they were incredibly kind to me like that. And they weren't anybody I knew. They were just somebody in the group just decided, well, we can't leave that guy behind. So that was amazing. I think initially I was kind of, it was just this sense of awe, and I still feel I've been back to Kenya quite a few times, and occasionally you're just out running and a group comes by and you just think, right, I'm just going to join this group just for 5 minutes. I'm going to be killing myself, but I'm just going to get that experience again. I think as a runner, the experience of being in a group of Kenyans, and when they're running, they all run in silence. I mean, if they're running really easy, they chat, but on a kind of medium pace run, it's just this silence and this really light feet on this dirt road, and you're just in it, and the beautiful, the countryside is beautiful around there, and it's just such an epic experience. So I was kind of very much in that frame of mind initially. After my experience in the race, I definitely realized pretty quickly, I was never going to be even anywhere near any of these guys. But definitely by the end, so I was there for 6 months. By the end, I remember thinking about it like this: what had gone from inspiring was now becoming demoralizing. Like always being the slowest runner, someone always having to look out for you, always being last. And then it was a real joy to get back to England and go back to the running club and be in the fast group. Suddenly I was one of the fast runners. It was like, what? This is amazing. And so yeah, for about 3 months it was inspiring. And then just always being the slowest runner in the whole town was pretty humiliating. There was my half marathon time when I went out there was 1:26. So that because they're all running, 61, 62 or 59, they don't talk in 1 hour or something. They talk in minutes. So that's 86 minutes. So I remember this woman asking me, what's your half marathon time? And so I was thinking, okay, 86, that's just too embarrassing to say. I mean, that's so slow for here. So I kind of said, I'm trying to run 70 something. So my goal was to run under 120, which I have done since. But I just said, 70 something. And she was like, 70? And I was like, well, not really 70. That's quite a long way ahead. But I just thought, okay, yeah, I'll just say it. I said 70. Yeah, 70. That's my half marathon time, 70. And she's looked at me and was like, that's a girl's time. And I was like, oh, in my wildest dreams, I could run 70. I'm never going to be able to run 70. And you're still dismissing it. So that's the level of disconnect there. They couldn't even comprehend my times. If I told them, it was like looking at me, you've got legs, you've got arms. Well, why are you running so slow? And then, like I say, you come back to the UK, and I'm most people think I'm quite a good runner. I'm quite a fast runner. So it's a whole different world of numbers, and the times are just completely different.
I love how blatantly honest she was with her thoughts about your wildest dream best time being so slow. It's funny, I guess in the UK or here in Australia, the last thing you would do is actually criticize someone's time. Even if you thought it was rubbish, you'd probably sugarcoat how impressed you really were with it. So, as a culture shock in itself, that would have been an interesting experience. But it seems, and one of the things that I was really keen, as I mentioned to you, to discuss today is how many variables you seem to discover, which led to the dominance of the elite Kenyan runners. And obviously one of the real standout features of the book for me was just how many there are. It's not just the altitude, and it's not just the group training. There's almost dozens, or I'm sure the list goes beyond what it is that you actually mention in the book. It seems like a constant discovery. But one thing that stands out to me, and you mentioned it to a degree, just with the way that the Kenyans were running their 6-minute kilometer pace or 10-minute mile pace, is they seem very intuitive. Like that kind of training in the West, whether it's UK, Australia, America right now, that lactate or that zone 2 style training has become very popular in recent, at least the last couple of years, but particularly the last 6 months. But it seems like intuitively the Kenyan athletes, whether they were being guided or whether this is just something that they've recognized as working, had an awareness of how effective that really slow running is. Can you talk about that in a little more detail? Because it'd be interesting to know from what you experienced how much of their running week was actually done at that quite slow running pace.
Yeah, I mean, they would probably do a lot of it. They would usually train twice a day. I mean, I found so I also, and if I did a follow-up book on running in Japan called The Way of the Runner. So that is about the whole ekiden and the professional running scene in Japan. And the contrast is quite incredible. And so the Japanese, people talk about, the Kenyans, it's all hard work. And I mean, it is focus and dedication, but a lot of that focus and dedication is on rest and it's on easy running. Where in Japan, they really, they're training 3 times a day. It's always fairly pacey. where the Kenyans, yeah, they train twice a day, and the second run almost always is at that kind of pace. Sometimes the morning run too, so they just do 2 slow runs. But by contrast, they also obviously go fast sometimes. And so when I was in Japan, actually, I had a real insight into it, almost more there, because they have these Kenyan runners who go to Japan. They get picked up for the professional teams in Japan. And one of them, he said to me, if the Japanese trained like the Kenyans, they'd break all the world records, because there's just so much support and so much fervor around running, way more than even in Kenya and Japan. And I was like, so what's wrong with the training? And his answer to that is really insightful to the Kenyan way of running, because it was like, because I was thinking, well, the training, that's not normally, you don't normally think about the Kenyans, what their secret isn't usually the training. It's usually the altitude or the upbringing or like you say, the numbers. So I was really intrigued to hear their training. And actually it's actually a couple of Ethiopians repeated almost word for word this kind of same idea. And there were 2 things. One is that, so he said, well, the way they both described it was no forest. So in Japan, all the training is on tarmac, on the roads, on smooth kind of concrete trails, concrete paths and stuff. Where in Kenya and Ethiopia, I also went to Ethiopia, they do all 95% of their training on trails. So they're running on dirt roads. In Kenya, they're running on dirt roads. In Ethiopia, they actually run through the forest and they're like clambering over rocks and stuff. But yeah, in Kenya, it's these big wide dirt roads, but the surface is uneven and it's a bit more giving than concrete. So they felt like that was the problem. And then the second reason, he said, no speed work. And this was really interesting, because he said the Japanese, they kind of constantly running, even when they're running easy, they're tiring themselves out. They're running 3 times a day. And so when they come to speed work, he says they're too tired. He said they can't do speed work because they're always tired. So in Kenya, you kind of go easy, 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 and then bang, you go. When you do speed work, you do it properly. You do it hard, you do it fast. And they also do, they do also in Kenya, which you didn't mention, but when they do the long run, they do it pretty hard as well. The weekend, they do a weekend long run, and that's usually done at pretty epic pace. I mean, I saw guys do 40K long run, so just short of a marathon, on a rolling dirt hill on a training run in 2 hours 8. And that was just drinking water. I mean, the guy who did that, then about 2 weeks later, after that was his like final run before the London Marathon. It was Emmanuel Mutai. That year, he went and won the London Marathon 2 weeks later on a course record at the time. So, they're kind of high level stuff, but yeah. But in order to allow that intensity, that intensity of training, they spend a lot of time running very slowly. So it's that, yeah, it's kind of a lot of fast or slow. It seems to be their way. I mean, I know there are other ways to do it, but that definitely is the Kenyan way. You do a lot of really easy running, and then when you go hard, you go really hard.
Mm. The structure, when you say it like that, it actually doesn't sound too different to the way a lot of Australians at least train. I mean, if you looked at it from an 80-20 training principle perspective, I would say, like here in Australia, you've got a lot of athletes use their key harder session days as Tuesday, Thursday, and some Saturday. And the other days are all relatively easy, or at least on paper, they're relatively easy, but perhaps a little more like what you explained, the Japanese focus is. I think so many athletes get caught up in the rhythm of some of those races. In some of those easier training sessions. I know for me, there was quite a while in the latter part of my more competitive years as a runner where I was looking at that as an advantage to go out and say, rather than trying to run at 4-minute pace or 5-minute pace, I might go out and try and run at 4-minute pace with the intention of building up some form of speed endurance. And I think, the opposite seemed to be true for me. Rather than improving, I did definitely seem to have some level of plateau. And I think the difference from what you explained, from what I understand, is that, when they're going easy, they're going very easy. But I was actually going to ask you about that long run, because the NN running team, if I remember their name correctly, on YouTube, had a video dedicated to the long run in Kenya. And it was a real standout feature. Eliud Kipchoge was speaking about, they might wake up at 5:30 or 4:45. They start their run at 5:30. And then they're just shocked at the fact sometimes they feel as though they're still dreaming because someone's taken it out at 2 minutes 55 and they've got 39K to go. And they go, oh my gosh, like this doesn't seem Real. So with that Sunday run, is that a fairly consistently fast run from what you remember or from what you know, or is that something that they tailor a little more specifically around particular marathon races that they have coming up?
Yeah, they definitely build up. So yeah, they do tend to do it on Saturday. Actually, the training, going back a little bit, the training is, I mean, the system is very much like 80-20, I think, if you look at it. But like you say, they do the easy runs really easy. That's the kind of key distinctive part. And it was kind of introduced by the British under British rule. There's a guy, Bruce Tuller, who was a European champion British guy who was kind of in charge of training the military back when it was still under British rule, and that kind of training system is still there. So in a way, yeah, Tuesdays and Thursdays are still the speed days, and then weekend Saturday long run. Yeah, I did a long run with the NN team. Eliud Kipchoge wasn't there that day, but at that time he wasn't like necessarily a standout star. So in a way, I didn't even notice that Emmanuel Matai was the kind of star of the team that day, and there was a young Ugandan guy who I hadn't heard of, called Stephen Kiprotich, who then in 2012 won the London Olympics, and then the year after won the World Championships, and he was just behind Emmanuel Matai that day. So I joined that team, and actually they start the run at 5:30, but they have to get there. So we had to get up at 5 in the dark, pile into this minibus, about a half an hour drive, and then and then we got out. And my plan was to join in the run, which was, I was still in this ridiculous state, and it's a kind of funny moment in the story, because I'm asking them what kind of pace they're going to be going. And on the bus, the kid next to me, he's a young kid. I said, what kind of pace? He said, oh, probably like 15, 16 minutes for each 5K. And I was like, I can't run that fast for 5K. What the hell? And I was like sitting there going, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And then I was just standing around, and I hadn't kind of worked, because it was early in the morning. I was kind of confused. What am I going to do? And then I saw there were like 3 women in the team, and they were kind of lined up, ready to go, while the rest of them were standing like in their jackets and stuff. I was like, what are they doing? He said, oh, the women get a head start. I was like, oh, this is what I need to. I need to run with the women. So I ran with the women, and they did do it a bit more progressive, and it was about 20 minutes for the first 5K, and I managed to get to 15K with them before I had to drop out. But they were all doing 40K, and the men came flying past at about 10K in, and yeah, they were moving like I say, that day he ran 2:08. I think in theory they built it up progression wise, but yeah, so that was that experience. But in terms of, I don't think they always do a 40K every weekend on and there were different guys that day. So Emmanuel Matai was, he was maybe it was 3 weeks out from London, so it was his last big hard run, where some of the other ones didn't have a marathon coming up quite so soon, so they actually stopped earlier. And the group did spread out. He was really pushing it. Some of them were probably pushing it a bit less. But yeah, the general idea is that it's kind of a race pace long run. The other interesting thing is, I mean, this may have changed now, but they weren't taking on anything other than water, and they didn't eat before they ran either. So they did all this on an empty stomach, just water. And then we got back to the camp, and I was starving. I was staying at their running camp, and it was probably 10 o'clock in the morning by then. And they all just kind of sat around, and I was like, surely we're going to get some food at some point. But they had tea. So they do have, it's like their recovery drink. It's like tea with a lot of milk and a lot of sugar, very sugary tea. So I guess in a way it's got protein and fats and sugar. But yeah, I was amazed. We didn't eat until lunchtime then. I'm not saying this is necessarily what is advised, but this is what happened that day. And I mean, I think things have changed a little bit since then, although in some ways I kind of feel like when you look at Kenyan performances, and of course you've had Eliud Kipchoge appear since then, and now Kelvin Kiptum, and there's been some amazing times on the women's marathon. But in terms of Kenyan dominance of marathon running and in fact distance running in general, 2011, the year I was there, was almost like the peak. That year in the World Championships, they won a record number of medals. I think they won 36 medals that year, which is astounding. I mean, in the women's 10,000 meters, I remember they came first, second, third, and fourth. They won every major marathon was won by a Kenyan in a course record that year. So yeah, there was a real, although the times have got faster, there's debate about that could be other things. But in terms of how they were training, I think it was really at a kind of crescendo. There were more and more opportunities coming on the roads, and the numbers were in. I think the numbers, coronavirus has had a big impact, because there's 80% of the runners in Kenya are living on the hope of earning money. They're not actually earning anything. And then when all the races stopped and prize money started getting a bit thinner on the ground, as far as I'm aware, that's had an impact, and it's kind of even harder now than it was then. So yeah, it was all kind of building to this crescendo around 2011. Just like the fervor and the numbers. And so the NN team, they had probably like 15 runners, but then they have a kind of second van, which is all the people who aren't quite in the team who live nearby, and they just all get in that van. So there were like 40 runners in that group. It was, yeah, pretty insane. And all of them, I reckon they could all run. Well, I did a brilliant interview with a guy called Abdi Nagay, and Dutch Somali runner who joined the NN team, and he said he was the slowest runner in the team, and they actually used to joke about him, like how slow he was. And then in the Tokyo Olympics, he came second in the marathon. So this is the standard. Like even the slowest guy couldn't come second in the Olympics. So
you should have spent 12 months there.
Well, I do end the book, because that Ugandan guy, the young Ugandan guy, I mean, he's Kalenjin, he's brought up at altitude, he's got lots of the Kenyan traits, but he had been there for like 5 years or something, living in Kenya, and then he won the Olympics. So yeah, I was like, 6 months wasn't long enough.
Gee, it's really interesting to hear you talk about those 40K long runs with nothing but water. And this is something that I often wonder, like, as amazing as the technology, whether that be shoes or the sports drink or the access to data that we have now, a lot of the time it seems that the best approach for many athletes is some form of simplicity. And I often think about how much we sacrifice in terms of stress and overwhelming ourselves with relatively superficial things, how much that stress actually correlates to a poorer running performance. And I say all that to say that yesterday I was listening to an Ironman, former Ironman world champ, Craig Alexander. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, Australian Ironman, absolute gun. And he was saying that a big part of his off-season training was focused on not actually taking on carbohydrates when he went out for a long bike ride, when he went out for a long run, with the full intention of actually training his body to be able to actually use the fat stores for a latter part of the race, where you might not have the carbs, you might not have the fuel that you really need, but to be able to equip yourself to be able to tap into that if you need it. And I often wonder how much, in the name of following the science and giving ourselves the best opportunity to stay hydrated, take on electrolytes, use the best sports drinks, we're actually, in a weird way, kind of costing ourselves the ability to tap into, whether it be physical discomfort or actual physical transformation through taking your body to a place that it hasn't been. And I don't know what the balance is, because I know Eliud Kipchoge uses Morton when he's out there on marathon race day. There's no doubt that there's actual performance benefits when it comes to using these things. But I wonder, with a schedule or some structure around, consciously abstaining or staying away from that, whether there would be any physical benefits. I'm not sure if you've thought much about that, but I was just interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a tricky one, because, and like you say, they do use them in the race, and they definitely help in the race. Whether there's a benefit to not using them in training, and I just, I wonder now, particularly that group. Now it wasn't the NN team; it was just called Global Sports back then, and I know they've changed some of the food they eat. It's difficult to say with the nutrition, because I know there are athletes who almost do the opposite, where in the training they're taking on more carbs, because that allows the body to kind of trains the body to absorb carbs in training. So there's a British ultra runner, Tom Evans, who's just basically in his training he's actually overloading his carb intake to build up his body's ability to take on carbs in the race. So I'm not really an expert on that. I know it's kind of tricky, but the technology one's interesting, because I know these athletes they kind of purport to like play the game with the technology. But this Dutch Somali guy, Abdi Nagay, I asked him because he was training with Kipchoge for about 2 or 3 years before he got this silver medal in the Olympics, and I asked him what was the best advice Eliud Kipchoge ever gave him. I said, he must have talked to you in all these years you were there. And he said, yeah, he told me to stop looking at my watch. He said, when you're running, he said, why do you look at your watch the whole time? And the guy's like, well, I need to know what pace. He said, why? Why do you need to know? He said, if you're going too fast, you're going to slow down? He said, what? No. Or you're going too slow, you're going to speed up? Well, you can tell if you're going too slow. You need to keep up. Just keep up. He's like, and because I know when I was there, they weren't looking at their watches at all. And sometimes, you see them in interviews saying, oh yeah, the watch is really important. But I think it's because they're sponsored by the watch company, in my opinion. The other funny story was when they were doing the Breaking 2, the first attempt to break the 2-hour marathon, they gave them all these like watches, the Nike team, so that it could analyze their training. And they noticed the guy Tedesse in Eritrea was like running like 250 miles a week, so like 300 kilometers a week or something. They're like, this is crazy, he's in so much training. And I was telling this to my Kenyan friends, and they just started laughing. They say, he's not running that far. We know what he's doing. His friends are looking at his watch going, that looks like a nice watch. Can I have a go? And he's going, yeah, have a go. And they're all borrowing the watch going, oh, I want to have a go. And they're all doing like 4 or 5 runs a day. And it's like, God, and the Nike guys going, Tedesse. But to hand it to the Nike guys, they then went and spent some time with Kipchoge. And the whole idea of that project was to marry, the kind of science of Nike, the best Nike sports scientists, marry that kind of technological advancements with, the raw kind of talent of the Kenyans and Kipchoge. And to be fair to the Nike sports scientists and the team, when they went to Kenya to study Kipchoge training, and their conclusion was, we don't need to change anything. This guy knows exactly what he's doing. His coach, Patrick Sang, has got him on an amazing program. They've got an understanding. We just feel anything we try and say to them to change in their training is just too risky. It just looks so optimal. They did slightly tweak a few things with the diet. Like they used to eat white sliced bread in the morning for breakfast, and they got them to make their own kind of wholesome bread. But I think that was about as much as it went. A few little tweaks to the food, but mainly they realized, yeah, these guys, unsurprisingly, okay, right? You would think. I think a lot of people think it's just raw talent, just like, oh, the Kenyans, they're just different. And the Japanese have this idea, oh, we can't compete with the Kenyans, they're just different. But actually, they're really like, they're like, you can learn a lot from them, I think. Their training has been not like they've sat down and analyzed it in a laboratory, but they've kind of thought about it and honed this over many years, many athletes, many groups, and the top coaches have kind of spent a lot of time kind of fine-tuning this system that seems to work. And so there's a lot more you can learn. It's not just pure raw talent. I think that's a slightly unfair way just to think, oh yeah, it's just genetics, or it's just just altitude, or they're just the poverty, because those things are a slight factor, but those things exist in many other parts of the world as well. And the Kenyans really, they know that. I said to the Japanese guys, like, you should study these guys. These are like professors of running in your team, because in the Japanese team, the Kenyans would go off and do their own training. And I'd say to the coach, why don't you like take a leaf out of their book? So, oh no, they're the Kenyans, they do their own thing. I was like, yeah, but look how fast they run. Maybe you should like have a look.
It is interesting. You touch on that in the book. Before I get to the psychology of what it means to be a Kenyan for both Kenyans and for their competitors, before I stray too far from the point, you mentioned Nike and the goodness that they did with a couple of recommendations, but also leaving what wasn't broke. One of the points that I thoroughly enjoyed, I really love this. I work with a lot of athletes here on technique analysis, actually just helping athletes become more efficient with movement. And this was something that I was lucky enough to be exposed to relatively young through a coach here in Australia called Joe Carmody. He was the first coach I ever met who paid any attention to rhythm and technique and tension. And it became like a real fascination of mine over the last 25 years now almost. But in the running scene, as I'm sure you're aware, it's almost a surprise when you hear that an athlete has a focus on technique. It seems to be the other things. It seems to be the nutrition and the training and the shoes and the coach and the recovery, and all really important things. But the idea of the actual foundational movement that you're doing when you take place in running is, for whatever reason, it's completely forgotten. But to strip that point back to its very start point, I loved your take and your observation on the barefoot running in Kenya. And 2011, it was around the time when the barefoot running shoes really did seem to storm into the market. And I remember a lot of people wearing it. And you actually mentioned it in your book, which I thought was so on point, that the problem that so many of us have going from like a fully foamed supported shoe back to the minimal shoe is that we try and transfer all of our running into that. And as a result, naturally, the impact's too much. We've got to work up to it. But to hear about the respect that Kenyans, coaches, athletes had for European runners for whatever reason, or Europeans in general, I think you mentioned in the book that a number of the Kenyans refer to Europeans just being smarter. So we know what it is that we're doing, but nothing can be further from the truth when you look at running results. But you were saying that there was a direct correlation with a number of races that you watched with the advancements in the shoe technology, with the athletes that were running and the further back in the field that they were actually finishing. Whereas you looked at the ones at the front, they were barefoot. I mean, this is a whole nother podcast in itself. It's such a deep and awesome conversation. But I mean, maybe I could just hand that to you and you could speak to that, because I'm not really sure which direction to take it. So feel free to take it where you'd like. But it was a part of the book that I loved, from a foot structure to a performance, to a technique. It was just something that I think has been forgotten about too quickly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like you say, it's a whole podcast. I mean, I think for a start, I can see why. I mean, there's this idea in most of the rest of the world that you shouldn't mess with form, that you could cause injuries. And there is some truth to that. That's definitely, basically, if you're running inefficiently, it's not because you want to run inefficiently. It's because your body needs to, because something's not working in the body. And so, so having good form is not as simple as saying, oh, you should, look how the Kenyans run, you should run like that. You just can't do it. You might be able to do it for 2 minutes, but you can't maintain it. And trying to maintain it artificially is probably not going to work at best, and at worst is going to lead to injuries. Saying that, I think form is one of the huge key factors in why the Kenyans are so good, and why anyone who's a really good runner is good. I mean, it doesn't have to be a Kenyan, but you get the occasional runner who kind of is powering through on pure strength and talent and like aerobic ability. But if you're running the speed they're running marathons, you have to be able to run that pace, which for most of us is like we're straining every sinew to run 100 meters at that pace. To be able to cruise at that pace, your body has to be. It's not a fitness thing. If you take 100 meters and we have to go at that pace, we can't even do it for 100 meters. Yet they're cruising at that pace. That's not a fitness thing. It's not like they're super fit, because nobody's running out of breath over 100 meters, or not many people. So it's purely biomechanics. They can run at that pace without it feeling like they're straining, and that is just your body's movement is efficient. But getting there is difficult. It's problematic. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of clever coaching, someone who really knows what they're talking about. I think there's a lot of form coaches who you can just tell you, you need to drop your arms, or all sorts of things which maybe don't help. So I can see why some people say it's better just to leave it. I think if you really need to work on form, but one way of doing it, and this is what the Kenyans do a lot of, is like drills. And so rather than consciously trying to change your form, but trying to get that rhythm, that bounce, so do a lot of kind of bouncy drills to get bounce back into your body, that kind of stuff. And they do a lot of that. The guy, Brother Colm, the Irish priest, who's not a priest actually, the Irish patrician brother, who's one of the key coaches out there, and he also coaches the juniors. He spends they can do half an hour of drills every day, just doing the simple ones we know, like high knees, heel flicks, but they have a whole array of them. And the Ethiopians the same. I mean, there's these amazing videos on YouTube of all the Ethiopians doing these. I mean, they look like dancers. They're doing these amazing drills, and they put a lot of time and effort into keeping that bounce. They do, a lot of them most of them have a natural advantage in the fact that they grew up running barefoot, and I did. So yeah, I'd read Born to Run, which is the book that kind of brought barefoot running into the mainstream consciousness. I read it. I thought, oh, this is incredible. You just take your shoes off and you're going to run like a Kenyan. I thought this is amazing. My feet were a bit soft, so I wore these barefoot shoes. I thought this is going to be great, and it did feel good to run in them. But I injured my Achilles. But the Kenyans, and then I went to Kenya expecting to see barefoot runners everywhere, and the truth is, when all these groups running by, 200 Kenyans go by, not one of them will be barefoot. And I was really confused. I was like, I thought they were all running barefoot. This is the story I'd kind of bought into, and I was totally like, I hear it's me in my barefoot shoes, and none of the Kenyans are barefoot. What's going on? And then I went to a schools race, the junior race, and there they were all barefoot. Except, and this is where this happened, where there were in each race there were like 200 kids, school cross country, they all bomb off, and there were like 2 or 3 kids in each race wearing shoes, obviously the slightly wealthier kids, and all without fail in every race they were the last 2 or 3 in every race. And I remember pointing this out to the Kenyan like coaches, and at that day, just hanging around at this one school was like Mary Katani, who went on to break the world record in the marathon. It was Wilson Kipsang who went on to break the world record in the marathon. Just hanging around. A couple of them, I said, look, isn't it funny? All the kids in shoes are at the back. And they were like, oh, no, that's nothing. Don't think about that. And I thought it was funny because the prize for the winner was a pair of running shoes. And I was like, that's a bit funny, don't you think? They're like, oh, no, we all want shoes. Everybody wants shoes. That was the idea. And there's an interview with David Rudisha as well, which it's on there's a film about him breaking the 800-meter world record, and he's actually talking about running barefoot as a child and how amazing it is for your form and everything. And then the interviewer, who's Irish, Eamon Coughlin, is the interviewer. He said, so in Ireland we should get all the kids to run barefoot. And he was like, oh no, you misunderstood me. You don't want to do that, because there was a disconnect between the fact that this was a huge advantage to them and the fact that this was all actually a sign to them of poverty. And so there's a lot of movement there towards getting everyone's shoes. But really, yeah, generally, if you can, if you've got kids and you want them to be a bit more athletic, not necessarily for running, but generally in life, it is, and it kind of makes sense. It's good if you can do it as much as possible. If your feet are touching the ground, you're going to have better contact with the ground. Your feet are going to be stronger. You're going to have more bounce off your feet. Your tendons are going to be stronger. Everything's going to work more efficiently. But the idea that as a 35-year-old, I can just take my shoes off and return to that state, that's the problematic part. So now when people ask me about it, I'd say, I basically, unless you're really willing to like spend 5 years retraining your feet, going there, I just wouldn't bother, because you're more likely to get injured than not. But for someone who really, but form is key, yes. But how you get that form, it's tricky. I mean, there are loads of great things out there, and there are loads of great people who are doing great things with it. But there are also some people who just kind of saying you should do this, you should do that, and being prescriptive. And yeah, I think the safest way for someone, if you haven't got like someone you really believe in, is to just kind of work on the drills and work on getting a bit more bounce in your feet, because that's one thing you lose by spending your whole life in shoes is that kind of rebound off the floor. And there've been studies on that the Kenyans have much quicker bounce. And what's really fascinating is until very recently at least, the sport that Kenyans have dominated more than the event they've dominated more than any other has been the steeplechase. Until the last Olympics, from 1968 until the last Olympics, they've won every steeplechase Olympic gold medal. And yet there are no steeplechase barriers in Kenya to train on. And I saw this brilliant interview with the world record holder, Sahid Shaheen. That's his adopted name. He's a Kenyan guy. I asked him, how often do you train over the barriers? Because they were at the track in Iten and they couldn't see any barriers. So how often do you train on the barriers? He said, I've never trained on barriers. And he's a world record holder. And the reason is because they've just got that natural bounce. Bouncing over a barrier is no problem to them. And I've been running with Kenyans, and we come to a fence and it's like without even breaking stride, they just jump over it. And I'm like, amazing. hey, I can't do that. How do I get over this fence?
You got to
I can't
find the
even
gate.
climb over it. Where's the gate? And they're like, oh, right, okay.
Oh, well, you got me in trouble because I've been pretty focused. We live in a little coastal town here, so we're lucky enough for you not to look too strange if you're walking around in bare feet. So
Yeah,
so my 3-year-old has got soles of leather just because I like the idea of his feet. I personally just like the feeling of it when I'm out and about. If I can have an excuse
yeah,
not to wear shoes, I'll take it. I work from home now, so rarely do I have shoes on unless I'm out there going for a run. Because
yeah,
of the fact I'm 36 and I've never trained barefoot before. But with my little guy, he loves it. Like I watch some of the things that he walks over now, and I'm like, oh my gosh, even I'm grimacing a little bit. But my mum came to stay with us last weekend. We went for a walk down this. It was like a relatively. We're in the middle of summer. It was a hot day, and we were walking along like a sand path next to the ocean. And I mean, I was barefoot. My little man was barefoot, and she said to me, she's like, "Toss, this is just irresponsible." And I was like,
yeah,
mate, I was laughing because I was trying to explain the book to her, and she has no interest in running. She has no interest in Kenyan foot structure.
yeah,
And so to try and sell this point to her like it had any validity, she wasn't interested in. But yeah, I like that idea of just, having his foot in contact with the earth for how it feels, but also for how it develops his feet. So it was really interesting to hear that.
yeah,
Just before I let you go, the last question I was going to throw at you, and again, like all questions that I'm asking, could probably be an hour conversation. But Brother Colm and Patrick Sang are two coaches or two mentors, or a combination of both of those things that I'm really fascinated by. Um, what were a couple of standout features to you, particularly with regards to Brother Colm? He's a guy I don't know a lot about, but I've heard a lot of stories, and he sounds he sounds like an interesting character. I think I'd always imagine him as like a very polite, nice, just coach athlete. But he sounds like he's a little bit of a straight shooter as well. A couple of the stories you say in the book, he sounds like he's not backwards in coming forward to some of his philosophies and ideas around how he structures things.
yeah, yeah. He's brilliant. I mean, he was. I think he does slightly tire of people coming and well, he talks about it of people coming to find the secret. This idea
Mm.
that there's a secret and they want to know the Kenyan secret. And he's like, there is no secret. We spend years, like you say, they do all these drills. They live these incredibly monastic lives. They basically eat, sleep, run, and they do that to a degree. We have athletes in the West, because I actually did an interview with Kipchoge, and I said, how do we get better in the West? He said, they just need to build these training camps, and the athletes need to go and live there. And this is a guy who's like a multimillionaire by anyone's standards. He's still living in this tiny little training camp away from his family 6.5 days of the week, living in a bunked room, cleaning out the loos, cleaning out the toilets, cooking food, simple food. I was like, no one in England's going to live like that. No one, like no one, even if you say you're going to be a great athlete, they're still going to want to, live a bit more of an interesting life. And actually, that Dutch Somali guy, he in the end, he couldn't stand the camp. After 3 years, he loved it. He got Olympic silver medal, but in the end, he said, I'm going crazy living here. He said, if you've got a European mindset, you can't live this simple life. So there's a huge level of dedication which we can't really replicate. We can't comprehend. So it's not just So he kind of didn't like this idea that the kind of Western journalists or coaches or whatever would come over looking for this one secret that they could then go home and copy. So this is our whole way of the whole Kenyan way of being. But he did have a real understanding. Yeah, a lot of his stuff was about mindset. So he would think like what would distinguish a really great athlete like Rhodesia from lots of other athletes is just having the right mindset. A big distinction between the Kenyans and the Japanese, for example, is that the Kenyan coaches don't go on all the training sessions with the athletes. They just, like in the Japanese coaches, they get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, go up there with the athletes, often drive behind them in a car or at least see them off. And I'm like, why do you do that? I said, oh, they wouldn't go if we didn't do that. The Kenyan Brother Colm's never even been abroad to one of Rhodesia's races. He doesn't need to be there because he totally trusts his athletes. He's picked these guys who've got the right understanding, the right mindset, that they're driven from within, and he's quite clear about that. He also has that there was a guy who joked when he asked me had I met Brother Colm, he was going, he was a guy from Singapore actually who was living out in Aten. He said, "Oh, has he done his Yoda thing with you?" And it's like this is his where he gets kind of philosophical about it, but it is all about that connection with the ground, and he talks about having this relationship. The Kenyans have a relationship with the ground through being barefoot and understanding how to interact with the earth in a way that we don't understand it in the West, that we're always removed from the earth. We're indoors, we get in the car, we've got shoes on, we got coats on, whereas they're just kind of living closer to the earth. And he gets quite philosophical about that. And but you know, he's talking from experience. This guy, he's lived there since 1976. He's trained probably more than half the Kenyan top athletes have been to his training camps as juniors. Yeah, probably 80% of them. So yeah, they all love him. They all respect him. He's they call him the godfather of Kenyan running, and he really is. In fact, he's the whole reason why Aten is, because he was in Aten. He started the first training camp. The whole town, it was just a crossroads with a school on it, and he was a teacher at the school. The whole town was built up basically around him. So yeah, he's kind of crucial. He's a brilliant character. Yeah, you're right. He doesn't mince his words, but at the same time, he is lovely. He's very, when you get to know him, he's very friendly. But yeah.
Yeah, no, awesome. Well, for everyone interested, I'll make sure I link that and your other books in the description to this. I actually didn't know you had written a book on Japanese runners, and I'm so excited because I was genuinely disappointed when Running with the Kenyans finished. So I'm going to go and make sure I get myself a copy of that. Get stuck into it. But thank you so much for making the time. It's great to hear your stories firsthand from the man himself. I really appreciate it. It was an incredible book. It's honestly it'd be my top. I'm apart from like a classic like the Prefontaine, I can't think of a book that I put in the same category of it. So for everyone listening, make sure you grab it. But yeah, thanks again for stopping by. Appreciate it.
That's all right. Thank you for having me. It was nice to chat.